Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with Liz Brown in conversation with Matt Tyrnauer discussing Twilight Man, Love and Ruin in the Shadows of Hollywood, and the Clark Empire. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation in the chat area. And we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future. And if you'd like to learn more about those, you can follow us on social media at BookSoup. You can sign up for our email newsletter on our website. And you can also follow our Crowdcast page right here to get direct notifications. And past events are also available on our YouTube channel. Please support BookSoup and our author tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. You can do that by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen, and it'll redirect you to our website where you can complete the checkout process. It will not interrupt viewing, so you can do that at any time. And we're also open for in-store browsing. So if you're local to Los Angeles, please stop by and say hi daily from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. With a mask once again, and we would love to see you regardless. So if you're local to LA. And with all that said, let me introduce our guest for this evening. Liz Brown is the author of Twilight Man, Love and Ruin in the Shadows of Hollywood, and The Clark Empire from Penguin. Her writing has appeared in Book Forum, Design Observer, Elle Decor, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, New York Times Book Review, and others. She lives in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us tonight, Liz. And Matt Tyrnauer, am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah.
Someone to ask you, okay. Is an award-winning writer, journalist, and director whose films include Valentino, The Last Emperor, which was shortlisted for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, Where's My Roy Khan, Studio 54, Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, and Citizen Jane, Battle for the City. His latest projects include The Reagans, a 4-part documentary series for Showtime. And as a journalist, Tyrnauer has written for Vanity Fair, where he was editor-at-large and special correspondent. His work has also appeared in other publications, including GQ, the New York Times, Architectural Digest, L'Uomo Vogue, and Numero. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Liz and Matt, and please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz, congratulations. I'm obsessed with this book. I've now read it and listened to the audiobook, which you in part read. And also I was very impressed that Bronson Pinchot reads the audiobook. Both presentations are extraordinary, so I recommend them to everyone. It's really, it's an epic. It's a true Los Angeles epic, and it's a secret history of a city that I think we both call our own and are both obsessed with and have both done examinations of the demi-monde of. It's so great to be here with you, and I'm honored to do this. I just wanted to kick it off by asking you a question that's the most basic, but sometimes the basic questions are really helpful. What is a Twilight Man?
I'm glad you asked. A Twilight Man was a term used mostly in the 30s, early 30s for gay men, and I actually even have some props handy, and I can show you this. I don't know, I guess it's reversing, but it says the story of a homosexual, Twilight Man. This is from, I think, 1931. And it was a kind of pulp novel written about a young man's sort of tragic love. But it was a brief term. It wasn't in vogue that long. And I came across it just in reading a biography about the Clark family, which we can jump into more. But I had never heard of it before until I opened this book about the Clarks.
Well, obviously the term applies, and it is kind of meant to allude to the lead character of this picaresque true history and secret history that was really, it's a detective novel, if you will, as well. I mean, it is novelistic, it's picaresque. By the end of it, I kept thinking of Candide, frankly. These characters, which is a picaresque tale, right? Are these picaresque characters who go through all these unbelievable scenes that are far-flung and defy belief, really. But your research is so meticulous, obviously they're true. So tell us about your lead character, a man named Harrison Post, who is the Twilight Man. And then the obvious question is, how did you happen upon this extraordinary unknown character?
Sure. So his name was originally Albert Weiss Harrison, and he was the son of a somewhat itinerant Jewish clothing salesman who, after a pretty bumpy childhood up and down the Eastern Seaboard in the early 1900s, he settled in Sacramento with his dad, who died when Albert was, I think, about 16 or 17. And then he was taken in, and picaresque is a very good word for this, and candide is definitely a good reference, because as soon as his father dies, suddenly he's taken in by this kindly older woman named Mary Post. And these sort of swerves of great fortune and terrible fortune follow throughout his life. So he's in this period of isolation in the 19-teens, and then he's taken in by this kindly older woman. He is working as a shop clerk at a store in San Francisco in 1919 when a very wealthy older man named William Andrews Clark Jr. Comes in, and a romance quickly ensues, and he follows Will Clark down to LA, where Will Clark is about to launch the Los Angeles Philharmonic, since he comes from this extraordinary copper mining fortune, Gilded Age fortune. So that's the setup, I guess. Well,
there are two strands here that I want to ask you about that are just unbelievable. First of all, if anyone knows who the Clarks are, they know them because of another insane, totally bonkers story. They came out, I think, in 2012 or 2013. I remember I found it on the MSNBC website. It was broken by an MSNBC investigative reporter, not on air. It was a print, like a web story. This guy did a great job, I think, of discovering Huguette Clark, who was was she the half sibling of Will Clark?
Yes.
Will Clark is the sort of like the second lead of this.
Yes.
Who is the son. They were both the offspring of Senator Clark of Montana, who was the Copper King of Montana and one of the most extraordinary of the robber barons. And I'll leave it to you to tell his story. So that is related to this, number one. Mm-hmm. Will Clark is related to this, and you are somehow related to Will Clark. And that's how this whole thing got started. Yeah. Because you found a mysterious photo. And we should say that Harrison Post, who you've been describing, was a very handsome man in the manner of Rudolph Valentino. And the Latin lover was what they were called then. There you go. Oops. I mean, look at that.
I don't know.
And you found that photo, which is how this whole thing touched off. So I've given you a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
You're related somehow to all of these characters, and you found this photo somehow that got you pulling on a string of yarn that I think you began pulling on for years and years and years, and it ended up with this book.
Yeah. I knew nothing about Harrison Post, nothing about Albert Weiss Harrison. I knew that my grandmother had this very wealthy uncle named Will Clark, and he had married her aunt, Alice McManus. And she was named for this aunt, and she adored her aunt and uncle, and was something of a surrogate daughter to them in a way. She was named for the aunt. She traveled with them and had this rather sort of charmed childhood, spending summers and visiting them. And I knew a little bit about that, but not that much. I mean, my grandmother was born in 1905, and she was playmates with Huguette Clark. They were a year apart, and they were sort of little kids in this strange, wealthy world together.
I just want to put a footnote in, because I didn't do a good job of explaining Huguette Clark at the beginning. Just very quickly, Huguette Clark was a very wealthy woman, an heiress with 2 mansions and a massive apartment in New York. But she decided to live in the Beth Israel Hospital for 20 years in a hospital room, and everyone lost track of her. But she was one of the great heiresses of the Gilded Age, and with a very kind of a strange French-sounding name, because there's a French connection, as it were, with this family. So that's who Huguette Clark is. We can kind of put her aside because the story you uncovered is every bit as crazy as Huguette's story.
Yeah. I mean, it has echoes of Huguette's. There's people in seclusion. There's a lot of greed and devious figures in the shadows in both stories. But so I knew that my grandmother had this tangential connection to this wealthy family. I didn't pursue it while she was alive, regrettably. It was after she died in 2003, and I was I go into this in the book in the beginning, but I had, in my 20s, I'd come out to my family. I'd told my parents I was gay. They really struggled with that. That led to a pretty painful period of a kind of prolonged impasse. And so I was living in New York, and I didn't go back to California where I grew up that much. And, but when my grandmother died, I went back for her funeral, and she lived in this beautiful house in Pacific Heights, which I would later learn she was able to buy because she had inherited some money from Will Clark and was able to make a down payment on it. But that would all come later. But so I was looking through her things, just kind of curiosity, sort of a kind of desire to just find some heirloom or idiosyncratic object that would kind of capture her for me. And I found that photograph, and which completely skewed my image of her, because she was 97 when she died. I knew her as an old lady who was somewhat eccentric. I did not know her as someone who would have known some beautiful young Rudolph Valentino style man, and who would have kept his photograph for 80 years. So just sort of created this curiosity, which I would never be able to satisfy. I will never know what exactly she understood about the relationship between her uncle Will Clark and Harrison. But I kept the photograph, and I would periodically kind of research and try to find out who it was, but nothing came up on the internet. I thought he must be some old movie star that's been forgotten, couldn't find anything. And then I started researching the Clarks independently. I knew there were these rumors that Will Clark had been gay, that he had secret lovers, and I was definitely interested in that, pulling on that strand. And especially in light of the kind of impasse with my parents, sort of wanting to feel connected to my family, even though that was difficult to feel with my immediate family right at that moment. So, and then I discovered this very scandalous, titillating biography called The Clarks, an American Phenomenon, that was written in 1941 or 40 by a very disgruntled former employee. And it was in that where I came across the phrase Twilight Man. And it said something like, the bulk of Will Clark's estate was divided among his perverted disciples, and identified Harrison Post and identified him as the type known as a Twilight Man and a degenerate in the Oscar Wilde vein. It just was this incredibly purple and kind of bilious language. So I realized I had saved this photograph of unwittingly, I'd salvaged this photograph of my grandmother's her uncle's secret gay lover. So that was the first kind of big breakthrough. And then a series of other kind of uncanny coincidences took place. And I don't know, within within several years, I was suddenly in the thick of this very bizarre saga.
Now, how we met very briefly is I made a movie called Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, and you approached me. We have a ton of mutual friends, and you approached me through one of them and said, did Scotty Bowers, who was the male Madam to the Stars from about 1943 until, I mean, he died a couple years ago at this point.
Yeah.
He was pretty, for someone in their 90s, he was actually, he claims, still active in the what would you call it? The Twilight Man escort business. he might have actually still had clients in the last year. Business.
I believe it.
But now, I asked Scotty, he was alive when you asked me this. You were in the process of writing the book, and he said he didn't know who Harrison Post was, but he also said he could have known him because people used fake names, keeping with what we're talking about now, this was really prominent circle. Will Clark was a wealthy man and a philanthropist who founded the LA Philharmonic, among other things, and he built a still present library in the West Adams district where his mansion and also Harrison Post's house, wherein his disciples also lived. He was one of the founders, in a way, of West Adams. And we're talking about going back to the teens and the era of the Huntingtons, and this is really the founding years of LA. So anyway, that's how we connected, and I have actually I discovered a connection actually in the book to Scotty, perhaps, that we have to research. But this is a bit of a sidebar that I will ask you a question. Ostrander is one of the names that comes up in the book, in your book, and Scotty's mother was Ostrander from the same part of the country. So they might actually be related somehow as kin.
That would be, yes, Mary Post, the woman who, the kindly older woman, was an Ostrander.
From Wisconsin? Or
yes.
Scotty's family was from Wisconsin, and his mother's name was Ostrander. So this is a subject.
Okay. Yeah.
As if it couldn't get more connected and stranger. But what I wanted to get at with you is that when you start to research LA, Will Clark's actually an easy point of entry because he is one of the founding figures of the city, and he also had a famous library that's still there that UCLA, I think, now oversees, and he was famous for his collection of Oscar Wilde editions, and you point out that would seem to be a tell that someone was actually interested in, as Lord Alfred Douglas put it, the love that dare not speak its name. But it didn't really read that way in the 20s of the last century. Oscar Wilde was a passion of many people, and his sexuality it was almost too daring to even talk about. But I want you to talk about how you got onto Will Clark. You could go to his library. Tell me what you found there. Tell me what you found there, and then tell me how you just actually got to Harrison Post, who had no record. You can't really, now you can, but before you couldn't really Google him and find out anything.
Yeah.
So tell us about that stage of your research.
Sure. I mean, the Clark Library is part of UCLA. It's closed at the moment because of COVID restrictions, but I think they're going to be opening soon. People have fellowships to study there. Clark, in addition to Oscar Wilde, he also collected 17th century British literature, John Dryden, other British writers, and he collected a lot of rare musical manuscripts. So it's an interesting collection. And he was doing that in the 20s, which was what people did instead of taking space flights. When they had lots of money, they built libraries and showed off their erudition, and then donated those to their communities, I guess. but the Clark Library was donated. He bequeathed it to UCLA soon after it was built, which was actually somewhat unusual to do while he was still alive. He deeded it to UCLA, although he remained on the property. And there's some speculation that that was actually something he was doing in order to kind of ingratiate himself with perhaps city officials, because of his secret life, that he needed to kind of keep bolstering his philanthropic presence. But the Clark Library is an active library today, and they have a wonderful staff, including a woman named Rebecca Fenning Marshall, who really opened the door in many ways and made lots of connections for me. The first time I went to the Clark Library, I was here for the summer from New York, and I entered and I was somewhat trepidatious of how this kind of, what seemed like it might be a sort of fusty institution, was going to respond to someone saying, I want to know about the secret gay lover. And Rebecca, I asked if she knew anything about someone named Harrison Post, and she said, yes, he has a really strange story. And she pointed to the ceiling where there are 13 male nudes painted on the ceiling in the Clark Library. And there are these kind of Michelangelo-esque beefy bodies in various states of contortion. And she said, they're all different bodies, but they all have Harrison's face. And then, so that was my first time on the grounds of the Clark Library. I would then spend a lot more time going through guest books and personal correspondence, but this was one of the huge challenges of this project, because it was criminal to be gay. Most personal correspondence was destroyed. So that was, I would say, in some ways the biggest challenge, was that there was a reason Will and Harrison erased. There was a reason Harrison's painted on a ceiling, and there aren't any letters that survive between the two of them. So that was my sort of archival introduction to Will Clark. And then she then connected me to a woman in the Bay Area named Sue Lombardi, who turned out to have her own connection to Harrison, who then very graciously welcomed me into her home and shared these journals and notebooks and scrapbooks he had kept in his later years. And in the midst of going through these amazing documents together, he realized she knew my parents, that she was good friends with family friends. So she is connected to the Mary Post, the Ostrander. And so the fact that it makes sense to me, it follows a certain logic that this would then connect. The connection you made with Scotty Bowers and Mary Ostrander is so reminiscent of the kinds of things that keep cropping up in this story.
I just lost your image. I hope that you're visible to everyone.
Oh.
Maybe your computer went to sleep. That sometimes happens.
Is it back?
No, we can hear you, but I can't see you, at least.
Okay. I'm just writing in the chat, how is the image, to see if people can see it. They say I can see. Okay.
I love it. All right. Well, I'm going to pretend you're there. Meanwhile, since I have the Ostrander thing, I found, for some reason, there's this incredible genealogy thing that just comes up when you Google Scotty Bowers. I don't know whether people can see this, but here's his family tree, and you can see he's the dark blue, and you can see Edna Ostrander is his mother. So
okay,
we have a lead, Liz.
Yes, it's a matter of a session on Ancestry.com and
but so more on first of all, I just want to comment also for people potentially thinking about reading this book. It's the most glamorous setting, this book. I mean, it really brings alive the glamour of LA in the 20s and the 30s, all the way down through the war years. And because these people weren't joking around. I mean, they were really living Gatsby life styles that Will Clark was financing, basically, through his largesse. And I learned, and I'm no slouch on my neighborhoods and the way the city was developed, but Liz has really gone deep and researched and made all these connections. And I learned about, for instance, the real history of the Uplifter club in the Pacific Palisades, where a lot of our characters in this book were hanging out in and around the Palisades. And I didn't realize it was LA's answer to Bohemian Grove.
Yes.
I was very impressed to find that out. And it makes it all the more spooky and creepy, although anyone who's hung out in around Rustic Canyon knows it's actually one of the most beautiful parts of the city. So, but that's where, correct me if I'm wrong, did Harrison Post get a place down there? And then he also lived in Castelmare, which is a development at the kind of mouth of Malibu near where the museum is. But tell us how Will Clark and Harrison hooked up. And then tell us about how Harrison basically, as my relatives might say, fell into a pot of schmaltz, basically. And went from orphan of questionable lineage to not only one of the best looking young men in the city, but one of the richest.
Yes. So yes, he 1 minute he was selling Orientalist wares in a luxury emporium in San Francisco, and the next he was suddenly had a villa across the street from Will and West Adams. He had a house on the Gold Coast. I think he might have sold it to Norma Talmadge at some point. He had a house, as you said, at Castellamar, and he had a 13-acre estate in Santa Monica Canyon, bordering the Riviera Club, just as it was being constructed. And so he was part of this. He kind of remade himself as this sort of country gentleman, and he would host riding parties, and people would go on long horse rides through the Riviera Club and through his estate, and he would host parties there afterward. Today, that his estate has been subdivided. I think it's about 13 different homes. At one point, I think his stables may have been Ted Danson's home. So there's a lot of LA real estate history in this book.
Let's talk about the secret gay city. And this is something that I think we're now both experts on. And we both went through similar odysseys. So I really was identified, but it was also, my hat was perpetually off to you for unearthing these secret places and these secret associations, but also the really disturbing history of the way law enforcement treated people of same sexual orientation in the city. Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood covers this. I made a point to do it because I think it's a history that the city, the historians of the city themselves want to cover up because they're ashamed of it, that the gay community isn't able to tell because people who could tell it were either in the closet or who were people who lived down into the late 20th century were decimated by the HIV/AIDS crisis. So we lost huge resources of people that could have told these stories. So it makes the job of historians and writers and filmmakers, such as we too, more difficult, but it also makes it in a way more exciting when you unearth these things. So explain the gay demi-monde that Will and Harrison were living in, and give us a little tour. Tell us about some of the places where people hung out and how they had to hang out, and also what they were up against. I mean, one example I know of is Pershing Square downtown. Where the Biltmore Hotel and a parking garage is now, but that was actually the center of gay Los Angeles before the war. and it was a cruising park, and there were
Yeah.
tons of gay bars around there, actually. Anyway, that's just one little example. You have many,
Yeah.
but I think people would love to hear about this secret history that you worked to uncover and where your characters were hanging out.
Sure. Yeah, Pershing Square is a great example. It also, the LA Philharmonic became known. The Ushers became known as a very good place to find companions, find lovers. Ramon Navarro and the composer Harry Partch were, for a brief period, both ushers there and had an affair. That's one of my favorite sort of parenthetical details, is just that early romance between the two of them. And at the time, the LA Phil bordered Pershing Square. It was called the Philharmonic Auditorium. It was kind of catty corner to the Biltmore. It's not there anymore, of course, but I always sort of kind of thought about the life of, going to the Harrison and Will going to the LA Philharmonic, that you could walk through Pershing Square, there would be some cruising, they would, then repair to the Los Angeles Athletic Club, back to their more, their straight life. That's just a sort of scenario I'm making up in my head. But they had so much money that they basically could have their own kind of world in the compound they had in West Adams. Will, over a period of about 10 years, bought up all the buildings on his block and ended up having this gated block. Harrison had a villa across the street that was also gated and walled off. And they were known, at least Harrison was known to host were indescribable orgies.
Where did you read that?
That was in the Mangum book, and I was bereft that they were not described, but but that's the sort of, I guess, the glamorous picture. The dark picture is that gay men were actively hunted. I mean, I think that's the best way to describe it. They were marks, they were targets. There were a lot of police agents who would go undercover, stalk them in restrooms or Pershing Square cruising areas, and threaten them with arrest. Get $20 to get the guy to just to make him
entrapment.
Yeah, so entrapment just ran wild. This was something I had to cut from the book because I just didn't have enough space, but there was a PR agent and another guy from Chicago who came out and basically advertised themselves as kind of bounty hunters. And they embedded themselves with the LAPD and then with the Long Beach Police Department, and would do these elaborate entrapment operations. In one case, they rented a cottage from someone they suspected of being gay, and then proceeded to go through very bizarre efforts to entrap him and try to infiltrate these queer societies. And I just think it was you realize, like, if you criminalize sexuality, then you also are monetizing it too. And the city officials were making money off of gay men being criminal. And is just a very dark net around them.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, as I was doing a lot of research, I just felt like, the things I would uncover would be like, here's a story about men dressing in drag or wearing makeup, or there was some story where of a party where every table setting had a penis-shaped lollipop or something, but which I guess is titillating on some level. But it also what was more what really struck me was just this dark world that encircled gay, queer men, and women too, but really, I think men were more targeted. It seems just this world of blackmail and extortion and entrapment that was also kind of was definitely legitimated by the police department and the community.
It was a racket.
It was a racket that, yes, totally.
The Vice Squad was notorious. The LAPD was notorious. That's why West Hollywood, in a way, developed, because it was under the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department, and it was less. The sheriff's department, compared to the LAPD, was more lenient. So
yeah,
it was already a kind of like prohibition gambling part of town, but gay people felt more comfortable there because they were less likely to be arrested in what we now know as West Hollywood. It was in the period when you were writing at the beginning of your book, it was called Sherman.
Yeah.
And there's so many connections. My God, I just want to outline a few. I'll be brief because I want you to be the big talker about the book. But I learned this all from Scotty Bowers. Number one, Ramon Navarro, who's in your book as a character, he was a client of Scotty's. And Ramon Navarro had worked also at Clifton's Cafeteria downtown. So he had these menial jobs. It was very pretty and was discovered and put in the movies. And he was a Valentino Harrison Post type. He was one of the prototypes rather of that look, which was the Latin lover was what they called it. After the war, the type changed. It became more like a Burt Lancaster or a Tab Hunter look, all-American boy. But before it was this dark, and there's so many euphemisms for it. There was like Semitic.
Yes, swarthy.
Right, exactly. Valentino was in fact Italian. But then Ramon Navarro, he has a film noir ending where he is murdered by two hustlers, actually. And it was really, I think, when the party ended, the glorious years of kind of covert sexuality in the city ended, I think, on the day of the Navarro murder, which I believe was in 1969. And the city started to become more dangerous. And the cities themselves everywhere became more dangerous in the late 60s and early 70s. And a lot of older gay guys who were denizens of LA have told me that. Scotty one, Gore Vidal another. And that was an interesting Navarro through line that mirrors Harrison Post. Another is that the gay legacy of music in this city, picking up the baton really from Will Clark, was a guy named Lloyd Riegler, who's also virtually unknown, who was the major benefactor of the Music Center. And he was a gay man who made his fortune off of a product called Adolph's Meat Tenderizer. And believe it or not, it's in every supermarket still. And Lloyd Riegler used his gay dollars, basically, to build the Music Center with Dorothy Chandler. But you've only heard of Dorothy Chandler. You've never heard of Lloyd Riegler. And no one knows that Harrison Post founded the LA Phil. So there's still a kind of creeping homophobia, actually, attached to all of these strands of history, just worth noting. Back to the Demi-Monde of LA, though, and I found things in researching Scotty, like the matchbooks of all of the gay bars had code on them. So they would have a pansy on them sometimes, or they would have, something like a rooster or something a little more obvious, perhaps. And these were the tells, these were the secret codes that you had to follow. But the houses that Will and Harrison built all had high walls and foreboding doors because they might have been straight on the street, but behind closed doors, not so much. So I think all of this louche behavior needs to be brought to light. So you can tell us more about that, but also more about the other characters that they all hung out with. Like there was Countess Defrost, these were people that were also kind of unbelievably picaresque, and all these lives intersect, and you weave these stories together so well. So let's just talk about the dark side, because I know that everyone watching wants to hear about that.
Sure.
Pick your genre.
Well, Dorothy Defrost is an amazing figure, and yes, her story will at some point, I'm sure, be told. I mean, at one point she was she's credited with introducing Gary Cooper to Hollywood, with sort of grooming him and, I guess, I don't know, teaching him how to use his fork or something. But she sort of like brought him into Hollywood society. She was linked with Cary Grant for a period, but her big paramour was Bugsy Siegel, the gangster, who she brought with her to Italy to meet her friend Benito Mussolini, because she was also an avid fascist and an ardent fascist, so much so that there's, a rather extensive FBI file on her. She was at one point trying to smuggle explosives out of Mexico into the US to try to, as part of some anarchist operation. She's a very fascinating character.
How does she connect to Harrison Post?
So they know each other early in the early 20s, and I would say they were the same. This sort of, as Hollywood emerged in the 20s, of course, the world of movie stars suddenly was this kind of new aristocracy in America, but there was also this sort of peripheral aristocracy. And there was one term for them. One of the contemporary news journalists called them the non-professionals. And today they would probably have a reality TV show, and they would be professionalized. But at that time, they went to parties and they threw parties, and they were rich and glamorous, but they weren't themselves actors. And Harrison Post was one, Dorothy Defrost was another. And so they knew each other in that milieu in the 20s. And then in one of the most sort of astounding, there are a series of astounding plot twists in Harrison's story. The darkest one is when Will dies in 1934, and Harrison had been convalescing. It's unclear whether he had a stroke or a nervous breakdown, but he was in a sanitarium. And within a week after Will died, and Harrison had inherited an enormous trust and all of his real estate, Harrison's sister had him declared incompetent. Exactly like the story unfolding with Britney Spears. So much so that Harrison's neurologist, who signed off and said he should be declared incompetent, turns out to be the grandfather of the court-appointed attorney who was handling Britney Spears' case for the past 13 years to a tune of $3 million.
It's amazing how nothing ever changes.
Yeah.
And the connections are insane. And reading this book, you realize that Raymond Chandler didn't need to make anything up.
Yeah.
It really, the fact-based narrative you have is more crazy and more Maltese Falcon.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much. Yeah. But so there's that moment where he's declared incompetent and kind of taken captive in the Palisades for a couple years. And then he manages to he's declared competent, and he escapes his sister through another plot twist, which is one of his male nurses, a Norwegian gentleman named Oscar, ferries him off to Oscar's hometown in Norway to recuperate. And a year later, right in 1938, which is no gay Jewish man really should have been going to Europe in 1938, but Harrison was. And so then he is sort of swept into, after escaping his sister Gladys and her captivity, he's then in the thick of Nazi-occupied Europe, and he's taken captive by the Nazis. I have to take a big breath because there's
it's so the modern Candide.
Yeah, exactly. But so when he comes back is when he stays with Dorothy Defrasso at her estate in Malibu, and she is raving of, she well, I won't go too far down the Dorothy Defrost rabbit hole, although it's a good rabbit hole.
Well, it's weird that he has to escape Nazi-occupied Norway and then ends up living with a Nazi sympathizer in Malibu. And the thing that I found a little odd about Harrison is that he kept dreaming of going back to Norway after he escaped the Nazis.
Yeah, no, Candide is a perfect. There's a certain cluelessness. Unfortunately, his story is true, but I think he was so. He did actually manage to have a nice time. Like, he had a lovely time in Norway. He learned to cross-country ski, and I think he could actually refine this invention of himself, which was this kind of country gentleman. Mm-hmm. And there, he was the only one who really knew his history in America, so he could pass himself off as this kind of aristocrat in exile, in a way that, when he came back to America, was a big challenge.
Right. Well, also things had changed because, you get the sense from your book that the years between the wars, when Hollywood was exploding, but people were coming to California, as they still do to this day, to reinvent themselves, you could really get away with a lot. And this was a great place to strike it rich and live an amazing life. And probably as mass media expanded and attitudes changed, the post-war years were very different. Of course, many people died during the war too, and it was a terrible time. I want to take this opportunity, and we can keep talking, and I have tons of questions for you, but if the viewers want to type their questions in, I will ask them of Liz on your behalf. So feel free to go right ahead and do that. Things just start to take terrible turns, though. I mean, you can't believe that there's another twist coming around the corner at certain times. And you're kind of ponging between really beautiful parts of LA, and then he goes up to San Francisco at a certain point, and he's house guesting with the most extraordinarily glamorous people, the Starretts, who built the Empire State Building, and Countess Defrost. I want to point out that there are two countesses of questionable origin in this book, which is a lot for one book. So you might want to tell us about that as well, and all the kind of the crazy house guesting he's doing. Harrison seems to only pick terrible, cruel alcoholics as his as well.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that he sort of loses about 10 years of his life in there. It's about 10 years, or maybe 14, more than that, sort of when he's declared incompetent through the war. So he has this thing, his life kind of mirrors the economic life in America, in terms of, having these fabulous 20s. And then as the Depression hits, his own life takes this very dark turn. And then suddenly his whole life is arrested by the war. And then when he comes back, he's not quite, I think he's been so broken by everything. He's not quite able to make the next move to reinvent himself yet again.
He lost most of the money that Will Clark left him. And how did he manage to lose all that money? And how much did Will Clark leave him?
Well, so he had there were at least 3 properties, including the 13-acre ranch in the Palisades that is now, I'm sure every single acre on that is several $1 million of real estate. He had that, and then Will set up a trust because of his health issues. Will set up this $100,000 trust, which would be about $2 million today, maybe more. And his sister Gladys had that liquidated. She sold off all his antiques. She sells off his books. This, in one of the most sort of tragic moments to me, she sells off this library he's collected over the years with Will to George Cukor, to J. Paul Getty, to all these so-called peers, kind of dismantle the library in a way that really echoed what happened to Oscar Wilde when he was taken prisoner. That his whole library was also chopped up and sold off, which is one of the more uncanny and sort of dark moments.
Yeah, explain that a little more. It really is incredible, the parallel you draw between the demise of Oscar Wilde, who had this cataclysmic last 5 years of his life, where he's in Reading jail, and then his health is destroyed, and his relationship with Bosie is on the rocks, and it's nothing good really happening.
Yeah.
Then Will Clark, it so happens, becomes, I think, the world's leading collector.
Yes. Yeah.
Then those two gentlemen have a kind of Bosie Wilde. It's not exact, but things go south, and Oscar Wilde hovers over everything. Somehow.
Yeah. I almost feel like he's sort of he becomes a ghost in this story, and in that Will and Harrison, at one point, Will purchases a large, he purchases a number of rare letters that Wilde had written to Bosie, and they track from before he's imprisoned to after, and you can see the arc of that tragedy in the writing of those letters. And Will purchases those letters from John Stetson, heir to the Stetson hat, just by the way, which is one of the things I love.
Not a gay man.
He was not a gay man, and this was sort of, at that time, book collecting was again a way you displayed your wealth and kind of scholarly gravitas, and Wilde was considered a find. So Will buys those letters, and then Harrison transcribes them, and I sort of pictured it almost as if they are reinscribing Wilde's tragedy into their own lives. And there's so many echoes in terms of just estrangements in families that mirror sort of what happens with Wilde, being unable to have contact with his sons at the end of his life, to Harrison just being this kind of vagabond in his final years that really echoes Wilde's story as well, who was in this state of perpetual exile.
And went from the grandest of the grand, and was a spendthrift as well.
Yeah.
Lies in a rather squalid hotel room in Paris, which has now been made into a rather nice hotel called L'Hotel on the Rive Gauche, which you can stay in the very room that Oscar Wilde died in if you were in Paris anytime soon. Give us more of an LA tour, because I mean, this book works on about 25 different levels. It's a film noir. It's a Raymond Chandler-esque tale. It's a Fritz Lang-esque movie.
Yeah.
The John Huston-esque film, and it's a Roman Polanski-like film. It has echoes of Chinatown. As well, but it also has echoes of Oscar Wilde, and it also is a Baedeker to the lost Los Angeles. And I keep harping on this because one of the joys of making the Scotty Bowers movie was going around town with my own Harrison Post, Scotty Bowers. So I had the benefit of having the real McCoy with me in the passenger seat, and or sometimes the driver's seat because he was driving terrifyingly. He would show me where everything was. And he would say, oh, that was a gay restaurant. That was Frascati, which is where this club was on Crescent Heights and Sunset. And that's where the Numbers was. And the Numbers came from Frascati because the host of Frascati was a pimp. And then Scotty himself, of course, ran his brothel out of a gas station. So we have two examples that show what the world was really like here. And growing up in LA, you grew up, did you grow up in the Bay Area more?
Bay Area and Northern California.
We're both Californians, though. San Francisco has its own history. No one showed me any of these things, of course, because our parents are generally, by definition, straight. But I mean, just having the city peeled back like that is just breathtaking, and it unfolds in this book in such a magnificent way. Can you tell us more about the secret world that these guys inhabited? And the secretary, he was also known as the secretary, which was the way they got by, right?
Yes. Yeah, initially Will tried to adopt him, and so initially he's identified as the ward of Will Clark, but he was too old to be adopted. And then he's identified as Will's secretary. I mean, well, one thing my mind just went to this one quote he has in one of his journals, just in terms of the way people talked in spoke in code. He rarely wrote anything that would have that he could be found out for in the journals. He's pretty guarded in them in many cases. But at one point he writes about meeting a friend of Dorothy Defrost's, and he says, he was definitely social, so I responded to him in kind. And I don't think I'd heard social as, I think I'd heard musical as a euphemism for gay. Yeah. But I just love that, like, as if they would break into another language or dialect because they belong. This other gentleman belonged to the same tribe. I'm trying to think about some of the. There's one. There was one bar in Chinatown. I'm trying to think of what it was called. That was a notorious hotspot for gay life. The one around Pershing Square that Scotty told me about was the Crown Jewel. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Well, there were quite a few downtown. I know that they were owned. A lot of the same people owned them. They were owned. Yeah. They were strings of bars that people owned. Same owner.
And then his life kind of takes this dark turn right as the world of the pansy craze is launching in LA, which was definitely a big thing in Sherman or in West Hollywood.
Tell us what the pansy craze was.
The pansy craze, it was gay men, often in drag, performing risque numbers, or in a way they were, kind of more daring. They were Cole Porter-esque, but more daring. Bruce Fletcher was one of the kind of premier examples of that, and I think Ray Bourbon was another. But I listened to some of Bruce Fletcher's songs now, and they're so ahead. I mean, we keep thinking we are having new conversations about sexual identity and gender fluidity, and you realize this guy was singing about all of that. I think we need to have those conversations, it seems, every few years. But he's someone that it would be wonderful to kind of another person it'd be wonderful to rediscover, or just to bring to a wider audience. And it kind of opens up your sense of what, I don't know, I think when I started this research, I probably had I had a limited idea of just how wide-ranging people's lives were. And I think, as you know, just in digging into history, it's not that people become more complex, I think, and your ideas of what history, what the past was is much more complicated. And I don't know that, I'm not sure that answers your question, but
no, I think
years near it.
All these elements that are forgotten and how they're so present, though they remind us of now. They were so long ago. I'm struggling to remember the word in the depositions when they were persecuting, I believe, Harrison in one of the legal proceedings. They used a euphemistic word that I'd never heard before. Do you remember what that one was? It was not musical, but it was something.
Temperamental.
I'd never heard that before. Are you temperamental, young man?
Temperamental was probably the most common word used for gay men I don't know if I should say the most common, but was a common word used for gay men in the 19 teens. That was also something that was interesting to discover. Like, I was writing about Will Clark, who's born in 1877, and then I write about Oscar Wilde, whose trials are unfolding in the 1890s. And then we get in, as we arc into the 20th century, you see the language changing within only a decade or so. Temperamental wasn't there in 1890, but suddenly it is in the 19 teens. So it is a fascinating thing to just see how fluid our language can be.
And of course, gay was appropriated. It kind of pops up a little bit in pop culture in the 30s. Bringing Up Baby has a famous moment, the movie.
Right.
Cary Grant is wearing a woman's house coat in one scene. It's a screwball comedy. And someone catches him in a screwball scene and says, "Young man, why are you wearing that house coat?" And he says, "I don't know, I just went gay all of a sudden," and does this like wonderful jump. It's maybe the most winning Cary Grant moment in all of motion picture history, and there are many. And that was an early instance of an ambiguous use of gay. But gay meant something else, really. It was a word in extremely common use. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, gay people started to identify each other as code with that term, and then it sort of worked its way into the language. But that was a self-styled appellation, gay. Temperamental certainly was not. That was a judgmental one, definitely. I mean, that's how I came across it in a news story about Harrison, and I came across it in the deposit in one of these cases of these elaborate sting operations. And yeah, there was an extraordinary sting operation in San Francisco in 1918. Just this stakeout where the police officers just held men in this home where there'd been a party for like days or weeks, it seemed. I mean, with no worry that they were violating actual laws, other laws. It's in that deposition where they ask people to identify other men who are temperamental. And it's kind of an extraordinary moment of hearing that people try to reject that title or that term and kind of cut through the code a bit, or the euphemism, I guess. Right. Yeah, it's not. Well, degenerate was more direct. That was also at the time. I mean, but this goes down into the 50s when Tab Hunter was, and Rock Hudson for that matter, were persecuted by the Vice Squad, and through the vehicle of Confidential magazine, which emerged a little later as a power. But the Confidential terrorized the gay and lesbian community in the city, and they threatened to out people, and the studio heads cooperated with Confidential, and there were many payoffs, and there were lawyers involved. It was a really frightening and ugly time. And if you watch the Scotty film again, you can see the story of Rock Hudson and Confidential. Mm-hmm. The studios traded Rock Hudson's best friend, who was a gay actor named George Nader. They traded George Nader for Rock Hudson, and they willfully destroyed George Nader's career by outing him in Confidential, or allowing him to be outed in Hudson's career, because they had invested more in Hudson. And this is the way the world worked. Yeah. It was a truly terrifying and sad time. And the thing is that the politicians and the police were very much in on it. So it was a fixed system. Mm-hmm. And it's I think one point you make so brilliantly throughout the book is that this is one of the city fathers, Harrison Post. We wouldn't have had the evolved LA Philharmonic that we had so early without him. And yet the city itself was constantly turning their mechanisms of power against him.
Yeah. I think in this case that would be Will Clark, who was he has to do this elaborate payoff to the DA at one point, who was a man named Asa Keys, which it's double indemnity, right? That it has Keys as is the name of one of the figures in that. But there's also in the Big Sleep, there's a moment where someone, speaking of Raymond Chandler, I think the DA comes to there's a moment of the DA and a payoff taking place. And I always sort of imagine that to be kind of reminiscent of this payoff that actually did happen between Will Clark and the DA at that time, in order to get a number of charges dropped. And just as those moments of extortion and payoff happened, I mean, Harrison was broken from certain things, but I think Will was also, by the end of his life, really broken by the amount of stress he had just how much he had to fight back against that. And I mean, he also, I will say, like, when I started this, I was really looking at them as these kind of gay martyr figures and thinking I was going to reclaim this gay love story. And that's definitely in the book, but part of the thing that complicated writing this for me was the intersection of their marginalized sexual status and their extreme privileged wealth, and that they were not black and white. It was not black and white when it came to who is a villain and who is a victim in some cases, and especially in the case of Will Clark. He's a very complicated, problematic figure in that regard, in terms of how he at times, I think, abused his wealth. And then at times how he was completely abused by the pathology of the closet. So.
Well, this is an incredibly nuanced study of this with, the picaresque narrative of the year. I can see the opera and the movie and the musical, of course, the musical. Are there any questions from all you people out there in the dark, to quote Norma Desmond? You can talk. I think we're both, if you want to ask questions about LA-ology, I think we both might be able to try our hands at them as well, because presumably the book just is hot off the press if you haven't read the book. Anyone else? Waiting for people to type here. You probably quoted this and I've forgotten, but what was the scale of Will Clark's inherited wealth in today's dollars, do you think?
At one point, there were a newspaper article estimated that he was worth $40 million, which I think I'm quoting that right. I don't know where they got that figure, but that would have been that was in 1925. Which is an astounding sum in that moment. His half-sister Huguette her estate in 2011 was, 2011 was 300 million. So that, I would imagine he was in that ballpark. Just an incredible, he didn't found the Hollywood Bowl, but he was pivotal in connecting the LA Phil, and he underwrote all the LA Phil's concerts in the Hollywood Bowl, which, of course, now is this very iconic LA collaboration. So he also had a hand in that.
Yeah, his fingerprints, as it were, all over the city, and even in the residential nature. He had places, of the people connected to him had all these incredible places.
Yeah.
The West Adams is just, extraordinary. This was, for those who don't know, it was kind of the Beverly Hills of its moment at the turn of the century. It is where a Will Clark would have built his, robber baron wealth common. And then, do you want to tell the story about how people kind of beat a retreat from West Adams and what happened? It's just it's another kind of heartbreaking thing. The freeway is the heartbreaking part.
That's what I thought you were referring. Yeah. The 10. Yeah. Totally destroyed that community.
Destroyed it because the gentry moved out, Beverly Hills, the things were moving west. Will Clark is among them. And then it becomes an upscale African-American neighborhood. And then the city, in its infinite wisdom, when they build the 10 freeway, decide to bisect West Adams in a very purposeful maneuver to create a physical barrier between an emerging African-American community and the rest of the city. It's a horrifying other tale. But your book again intersects with that. It's almost everything to do with LA and
you can go to Harrison. So you can go to Will Clark's library. His mansion was torn down, unfortunately, and is now a parking lot. But Harrison's villa is still across the street, and it is now a Zen center. And you can go and meditate there in the Zendo where the indescribable orgies took place. And I will say I've done that, and I'm glad I have, I guess. So it lives. These spaces live on. I think that's one of the wonderful things which about living in LA is sort of, if you are digging into the sediment, you kind of see these multiple histories in one place.
Yeah, we live in a Pompeii here, and we don't really know that we are. I'll wrap it up if there are no final questions from the viewers, but I am curious, and I know this is a very broad gauge question, but to find Harrison, what was your biggest find? Because these characters are absolutely come alive in this book, and there's just not a lot of official record there. You start with one photograph, you don't even know who the guy is. But what were a couple of your biggest finds that allowed you to paint this?
Sure. Yeah. The discovery of the journals, which again, here's one of them, just that he kept. This is from 1941. So the discovery of those was incredible. And that gave me, for much of the book, he is seen kind of through other people's eyes. He's painted on a ceiling. He's in that photograph. He's very much sort of an object. And then once the journals begin, I'm able to tell the story from his point of view because I have his daily experience, and that's a very marked shift to be able to do that, to kind of go inside the statue or the image. So those journals, and then the other big breakthrough was the case file of him being declared incompetent, which is about this thick, and it just details all the things Gladys is selling, all the things she's charging the estate, or the things that she at least put down. I mean, there were lots of things she sold that she didn't record. But that was, in a very different way, a very granular look into what was taking place in his life, just on a daily basis, through, down to the cents of what things cost and were being sold for.
It's fantastic. Do you want to add anything else before we sign off?
No, I think if people want to email me or check out further events, my website is lizbrown.la. One thing I guess I'd give a shout out that I'll be doing in a couple weeks on August 13th is I will be having a conversation hosted by the Clark Library with Bill Deadman, who wrote Empty Mansions about Huguette Clark, and Sue Lombardi, the woman who gave me those journals, and Stephen Grews, who we didn't get into this here, but who's connected to this story through his grandfather, who was the son of Will Clark's housekeeper. So that will be, I think, a pretty interesting conversation about family archives and the sort of legacy of the Clarks beyond just simply the Clarks. So that's something that I'm excited for that.
And Bill Deadman was the guy who wrote the MSNBC piece. Right?
Yes,
he was the
exactly.
one who
Yeah.
Right. It's just so wild that Senator Clark gave birth, I guess, in a way, or like fathered the two of the greatest American eccentrics.
Yeah. There's so much to say about Senator Clark and American wealth and the kind of extreme wealth we're seeing today, and how that story is how they prefigure so much of what's unfolding now, I think.
Yeah, it's funny if you read political science or biographies from like Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, or anything in that period, or there's a Doris Kearns Goodwin book about Ida Tarbell and Teddy Roosevelt, the Gilded Age, and the robber barons. I mean, the parallels to the tech robber baron they're absolutely vivid.
Yeah.
And, this book also touches that. You interlocked so many narratives in this country and this town, and you are to be congratulated. Everyone buy the book at Book Soup, of course. And I haven't seen you at the Chateau Marmont in at least 15 months, but this is a good way to get back into that. We have to research the Ostrander connection.
Yes.
Maybe Harrison Post and Scotty Bowers actually are related and they did not know it. Somehow related. We'll do another one of these crowdcasts if we actually find that out.
I like that.
Thank you, Liz. Congratulations, and thanks to Book Soup.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Book Soup.
Thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. I had no idea about any of this. It was quite fascinating to learn about. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in the audience. And don't forget to get your copy of Twilight Man at the green button below. And everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you all for joining us.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.